Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk about migration to Flow, migration of workflow rules and process builders. But before we start, a few words about me. My name is Sergii. I'm Salesforce consultant at Cinebo. I have more than 4 years of overall extensive experience in Salesforce analysis and implementation, a strong background in designing efficient end-to-end solution in sales, service, and experience cloud. Also, I'm leading the team of Salesforce administrators and teaching newcomers from time to time. Well, as I said, today we're going to talk about the migration, but before we proceed with the migration, we will talk a little bit about the flows in general, the flow types, the use cases where you have to use the specific flow type. Also, we're going to talk about limitations and best practice of building flows, how to test and debug flows, and only then we'll proceed with the migration. It's really important to understand all of these things before you're starting to migrating workflow rules and process builders, because it will be efficient if you do it according to best practice. So what are the flows in general? Flows allow you to build complex business automation using click instead of code. As a Salesforce administrator, Flow is going to be your best friend because you will be able to handle the majority of complex business requirements without the help of Salesforce developer. The benefit of Salesforce Flow is that they are easily to maintain because anyone should be able to follow along with what you build. Assuming that they are Salesforce administrators that have an expertise in flows. Let's quickly review flow types and use cases. Auto launch flows, those are flows that have no trigger. They should be called through Apex, process builders, actions, buttons, or another record triggered flow. The use case for auto launch flow, I would say it's a repeating process that's similar or even same and should be launched from different objects, but do the similar in the same action. For example, it could be like a custom rollup automation that you put in Flow. The automation that, for example, calculates some records under the master record, but assuming that you don't have a master detail relationship and you have to build it using the Flow. And where you have the same process, for example, it should be run on several levels, but you have one main auto launch flow that you can launch from different record triggered flows on the objects. The next one is the record triggered flow. It's I would say it's the best friend of the Salesforce administrator. It triggers when record is created, updated, or deleted. So the use case is if you have to trigger automation, as I said, on creation, on the edit, on the delete, and keep in mind that there is a possibility to run a flow before and after save and before delete. Also, it has a scheduled pass if you need some scheduled actions to be done. And also it could be run asynchronously. So if your use case is one of these, you have to use record triggered flow. Platform event triggered flow are called when the platform event is received. It's similar to auto launch flow, but it triggers when platform event is received. Also, we have a schedule triggered flow. It runs automatically to a recurring schedule. You can use it if you have some tasks that should be performed daily on set of the records. And keep in mind that the maximum number of scheduled flow interviews per 24 hours is 250,000. So when you build scheduled flow, you have to understand that it has limitations. If you have more, then if you need more interviews, I would suggest you to use the batch, the scheduler. Also, there is a screen flow. It's called through the button or action. It could be embedded into a Lightning page, and this cannot be run automatically. So it should be run from the interface, from the Lightning page or from the button, wherever. Then let's talk about the limitations. Here I put some of the main limitations that I face during my daily work. There are more of them. You can simplify them at Salesforce Help. But when you will build your new flows during the migration, you have to keep in mind at least those limitations. So let's quickly review them. There is a limit of the active versions per flow. So one flow can have only 50 versions. So if you hit this limit, you have to delete one of the latest one, the earliest one, the oldest one. The next and really important limitation is the number of elements that can be executed at runtime per flow. It means that you can, when you have a huge flow with the big numbers of the elements, only 2000 can be executed. You'll just have to keep it in mind when you build some complex automations. Also, the next limit is active flows per flow type. It's important if you have a professional edition, you can have only 5. All other editions can have 2000, and I think you will never hit this limit. But if you have a professional edition, just keep in mind that you can have only 5 active flows per type, and total flows per type on also 5. I already mentioned the next limitation of the schedule triggered flow, but let's talk about it again. 250,000 of flow interviews can be created per 24 hours. Also, 250,000 or the number of user licenses in your organization multiplied by 200. Whichever is greater, but it looks like some complex calculation, but it's pretty simple. The next and really important limit that I faced a lot on the complex organizations, it's total number of SOQL queries. It's 100. In my practice, I faced a lot when organization hit this limit and they asked us to refactor all their processes, and we worked on the. It was a simple process that looks similar to the migration, but we migrated all the automations into flows and even some old flows to avoid this limitation. The next limit is total number of DML statement issued. It's 150. You also have to keep it in mind. Total numbers of records retrieved by queries, it's 50,000. So it means that if you use get element in the flow, keep in mind that you can get only 50,000. If you want to work with more than 50,000 records, maybe flow is you have to use Apex in this case, or maybe you have to think about the criteria and make it more strictly to reduce the number of records. The next limit is total number of records processed as a result of DML statement, and it is 10,000. It means that you can update, create, or edit only 10,000 records in one at the time. So this is the similar to previous limitation. If you have more, maybe flow is not the correct tool. The next limit is the max CPU time on the Salesforce servers. It's 10 seconds. So if you hit CPU time limit, you also have to think maybe you didn't follow the best practices, you didn't avoid the limitations, or if you did everything correctly and you're sure that your flow built as efficient as it possible, maybe you have to switch it to move it to the code. And also the next but not least, total number of duplicate update allowed in one batch, it's 12. If you hit this in flow, I would say that something wrong with the design of the flow. So for some reason, it updates one record in one batch more than 12 times. It's strange, and you have to review your flows. Now let's talk about best practice. Here I put the most important, from my point of view, things. First of all, you extremely need documentation. When you build your flows, you have to do the documentation, but I understand that sometimes you don't have a lot of time for this, or even the customer doesn't want to invest a lot in the documentation. So I highly recommend to add the description per every element. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it comparing to documentation. In documentation, you have to invest a lot of time. But when you build the flow, you can simply write a quick description, 1-2 sentences per element. When you create, for example, a decision, and every element contains a description. So you just you can just write all the conditions to the user that, for example, to the non-technical user who will be on the customer side, who will be able at least to read and understand what this element have to do. Also, one of the best practices is to use subflows. As I said initially, you can use subflows when you have some repeating process. Instead of rebuilding the complex process several times, you can create it in subflow. You can trigger it from your record trigger flow, and then if you have to change something, you don't have to touch your record trigger flow. You can simply change the subflow, and it will be enough. So it's really comfortable to use subflow in this case. You don't have to change anything if you use, for example, the rule of 3. When you use 3 flows per object, and obviously it will be like a big record triggered after save flow where you will trigger your subflow. So I highly recommend to use subflows in the case when you need some repeating processes. Also, you can launch Apex from the flows. It's also extremely helpful. For example, if you work with a developer, or if you have some classes from the managed package, wherever, you can launch it from the flow instead of building the same process in the flow. So if you already have some class that you need, you can simply put it in the flow. The next really important thing is no hard coding. You have to avoid hard coding in the flow. I'm talking about the IDs, for example, the record type IDs, the user IDs, wherever, you have to avoid it. Use custom labels, custom metadata for this. You can simply use get element to retrieve the custom label based on the API name, and then and there you can put the ID. You need it because when you will deploy from one sandbox to another or to production, IDs will be different, and you can control it from the custom label. You don't have to change the flow every time, and it's also helpful when there is somebody non-technical or not that technical that can change the flow, but can go to the custom label and add ID there. So I insist that you don't have to hardcode any IDs within your flow. The next thing is loop. Take care when looping. This is really, really important because I faced a lot when somebody without the experience in the flow built a flow and used create, edit, or delete elements within the loop. You don't have to do this because you will hit the limits that we talked before. So you have to avoid any DML statements within the loop. You have to use only assignments within the loop as assignments in order to add values to collection, and only then, after the last item finish the loop, you can create or update records like in bulk using your collection that you created before. Also, a really helpful thing is to check for nulls and empty collections. What does it mean? It means that if you use get element and or you work with collections within the loops or wherever, you have to check, is it empty or not? in order to proceed further. So for example, if you get some records and then you want to update them, but the collection is empty, it's bad practice to proceed further and update it. So your flow can fail, and you also do like redundant query. So I highly recommend you to use decision element to check if your collection are empty or not, and only then proceed. Also, one of the best practices is to build a bypass. What does it mean? It means that you can, when you build the flow, you can create an additional branch that can go like overall all elements, and for example, to the last one, if you need some specific updates there. It can be done for admin users. You can create some checkbox on the record, or for example, on the user, and then you can bypass the flow. I can even tell you some use cases when somebody needs to do a mass update of the records and you don't want to trigger any updates, any email alerts, or wherever, you can use this bypass. For example, you can create a checkbox, call it bypass email alerts or bypass flows. And when you do a mass update, you can check it. And you will avoid running with all the branches, sending all email alerts, and doing all updates that you don't need. The next item is to keep the amount of flows to a minimum. This is what I usually stick to. I'm trying to avoid the big number of flows because it's really hard to maintain. So if I think that I can use one of the existing flows and add relevant action there, I would like to proceed in this way. I don't like to clone a lot of, to create a lot of flows in order just to add one email alert or quick field update. Also, the next one, you have to create fault paths. When you, in the flow, when you create some elements and you connect them, you can, once it's connected, you can link them again, and it will create a fault path. It means that if flow will fail, it will go to the fault paths, and then you can create some interesting things. You can send email errors to a Salesforce administrator in order to review it. Usually, Salesforce administrator have to receive exception emails, but who knows? Also, you can automatically create a case. If, for example, you manage your cases in Salesforce, you can simply create a case that some user was unable to perform some action, please review it. And it's really helpful. It saves a lot of time, and this bug can be fixed almost immediately. And also use the debug tool option. It's available for, I don't remember, for several years already. It's really helpful in order to test it. I highly recommend to, when you finish the building flow, first of all, run a debug, and only then test on real records. And also debug is very helpful for QA, because you see the full overview of the flow and of the record that went through the branches. The next topic is test and debug. Here I have some important items that I usually stick to in my daily work. So I think this is the most efficient to test and troubleshoot your flow. First of all, you have to add yourself or any relevant users to the Apex exception emails. It's simply in setup, input Apex exception emails and add your user. Then the second item, you have to change the recipient of the exceptions to the Apex exception emails, because by default, it's usually the user who triggered the flow. And in the most cases, this is the end user who is not Salesforce administrator. So you have to go to the process automation settings in setup and send process or flow error email to, and select Apex exception email recipients. So then you will receive all the emails. Also check the deliverability, because in the sandbox it's usually system only. Select all emails and you will receive everything. As I mentioned, in best practice, the debug tool is very important. So I will talk about it second time. When you test and debug, you extremely need to use the debug tool. The fourth item is create tests. This is the new thing. If I'm not mistaken, it's in beta or whatever. It will next release will be released very soon. It will work much better. And I also saw some updates in this feature. Briefly, it allows you to build a test similar to the tests in Apex. Instead of doing some recurring updates, you can create a test, and it's really helpful for QA engineers. Instead of, for example, every time creating a record, updating the fields, you can create everything in one time in test and then run it again and again and again. It's really helpful. It saves a lot of time, so I recommend you to use it. Again, use fault pass. I already said the use cases. I will not repeat it, but I suggest you to use fault pass in order to avoid errors. Exception emails. It's related to the first and second point. When you receive it on the email, you'll be able to review it. Usually it's not that hard to read it. If you are experienced Salesforce administrator, you will understand it, but also there is a button on top that will redirect you to the debug, but it will also show you the same error in the debug, and it's extremely helpful to troubleshoot the flow. And the last thing, but not least, the failed flow interviews. You can always find your failed flow interviews in the setup. Just input failed flow interviews, and you will find post and failed flow interviews. There are two list views, and you can check what flows failed in one list. Also very helpful. This is related to the test and debug. Now let's talk about the migration. So at the end of this year, Salesforce will be retiring both workflow rules and process builder automations. And your current workflow rules and process builders will continue to run, but you will not be able to create new. So it means that you will need to create flows. And as mentioned in Trailhead, for all behind the scenes automations, we recommend you to use Flow Builder. So I think the same. Flow Builder has much more options and features than workflows and process builders. It's much easier to maintain them. So I highly recommend to use flows. So now you're at the point when you have some old workflow rules, some old process builders, and you will start to create new flows. But depending how many active workflow rules and process builders you have, you can hit some issues, because I faced a lot when customer had tens of process builders per object, which is not the best practice. It's much better to have one or maximum two per object. And at this point, you will have to do the migration, because if you already have a lot of automations and you want to create flows, it will be better to start the migration at this point. And now this is like my checklist when I do the migration. First of all, you have to document list of all automations, existing ones. I mean that you have workflows, process builders, whatever. You have to create a Google Sheet and split it like object per object. When you will have one list of all workflow rules per one object, then you will be able to choose your strategy. Salesforce suggests us to use the rule of 3. It means that you can create just 3 flows per object, before save, after save, and before delete. and add everything to those flows without any entry criteria. So this flow will work very similar to process builder. You don't have any entry criteria and you have decisions in the flows, and it looks like a process builder with its nodes. I really like this one, but then Salesforce suggested another option: create multiple smaller flows with entry criteria. I personally don't like this strategy, but it can be very helpful for you. So you just have to stick to one of these. But I understood that sometimes it's not possible to stick strictly to the one of the strategies, and then I decided to use like the mixed strategy. It means that I still create 3 flows per object: before save, after save, and delete. But if I have some complicated process that I don't want to add to my, for example, after save flow, because it's already big, it's complex, and to add like the big complex process with a lot of decisions and branches and loops, wherever, I don't like it. So I create the separate flow, but with the strict entry criteria to avoiding launching this flow when I don't want it to be triggered. So in this case, it doesn't affect performance a lot because of the entry criteria. So you have to keep in mind, if you create more flows, you have to create strict entry criteria. Then you can use workflow to flow migration tool. This thing allows you to automatically migrate workflow to flow, but it's not that helpful yet because it converts workflow per flow. So it means that if you have 100 workflows, it will convert it to 100 flows. Also, it doesn't work with the conditions in your criteria. So in workflow rule, you have 2 ways to build your criteria: formula or conditions. So it works only with conditions. Sorry, it doesn't work with the formula for now. I'm pretty sure that Salesforce will update this feature, but now it's not that helpful as it can be. And if you stick to the rule of 3 strategy, it also will not help you because you want to add everything to one flow. It will create separate flows per workflow rule. So I don't use this a lot for now. Also, you can use Flow Trigger Explorer. It's a tool that allows you to visualize all flows in one screen per object, and you can easily understand how will it be triggered, on what object, and like on create, on edit, or delete. And it's really helpful when you have a lot of flows and you want to understand the order of them. You want to see it like all in one place to have a better understanding on what's going on in your organization. And then you have to follow best practices when you create flow. The best practices, as I mentioned a few slides before, and test and debug your flows. So let's summarize it a bit. When you will start the migration, you have to start with one object. Of course, you have to prepare a list of all automations per one object. Then I suggest you to mark those workflow rules or process builders like I usually do. I create some like columns, like this workflow will be added to the before save flow. This workflow will be added to the after save flow. And I hope you know how to use before and after, but if you want to update the record that was that initially triggered the process, you have to use before flow. For everything else, you have to use after save flow. If you want to update related record, if you want to create a related record, you want to send email alert, wherever. So when you look at your actions, in the workflow rules or process builders, you can quickly understand where to put it, before or after save. So once you have like the full documented list, you understand what you have to create before, after flow, you can start with creating it. And then you decide what strategy you use, rule of 3 or multiple smaller flows with entry criteria. And then you start. You have to start to create it. If you use rule of 3, you have to recreate everything manually. If you stick to the multiple flows, you can use a workflow to flow migration tool because it will create you new flows. But it still requires a lot of manual work. You have to review everything, and then you have to do proper tests. I also wanna keep your attention on the testing. How we usually test it. We take the existing old workflow rule or process builder, and we test that it works as expected. Then we deactivate it, activate our flow, and test the same functionality but within the flow. If it works the same as it worked in the workflow or process builder, it's great. You can go. You can move to the next item. If it doesn't work as expected, you have to troubleshoot it, test, debug, and test it again. Also, like from my expertise, I faced a lot when customer has some workflow rules and process builders that didn't work as expected. And when we moved it into flow, it started to work. And they simply didn't know that they have these kind of email alerts, field updates, or whatever, because it was initially built in the wrong way, not according to the best practices, and it also can cause a lot of issues when customer is not aware of this this functionality. So this is why you have to check the initial workflow or process builder and make sure that it's working. If it's not working, maybe it's worth to simply not migrating it to the flow, and you will have like less items to add to flow and less items to test. And maybe there are even some automations that are no longer needed. So it's really worth checking. Sometimes we check it like you can prepare a list and send it to the customer. It depends how on your workflow. And if you have some technical on the customer side, they can decide to leave this automation or not. So as I said, the workflow to flow tool, I just want to say a few more words on it. As I mentioned, the migration tool creates one for one flow. So if you got 100 workflow rules that have existed in Salesforce for a long time, and with using this tool, it means that you will have 100 flows. So this isn't ideal at all. And what I suggest, if you have, for example, 50 email alerts and 30 field updates, maybe you can think that you can create one flow for email alerts. You can create put all updates between before save flow and after save flow, or you will put your email alerts all in one after save flow and split the field updates between before and after according to what you are updating. So this is why I mentioned it requires a lot of manual work, and before you start, you have to design everything at least on paper, on Google Sheet, or wherever. So you have to have full understanding of the whole process before you proceed to creating the first flow. It will save you like a lot of time because you can face a lot of issues when you will if you will not design it properly. So, and also the Flow Trigger Explorer, it allows you or developers to visually see the order or in which record trigger flows would run against specific object. It also extremely helpful to the non-technical users. For example, on the customer side, they will be able to see the order of execution of all flows. If they have the description in every flow, description of the elements, they can, for example, find the relevant flow, open it, find the relevant decision, and according to the description, they can understand that they can, for example, remove this decision at all, or like deactivate it, reattach it, just for some time, because they don't need this functionality at the moment, or maybe they need it later. So if you do everything according to best practices, even non-technical people will be able to at least manage it somehow. So understand the order of execution and remove some branches within the flow. And some last words to keep in mind. According to the Salesforce, Apex is faster than any flows, workflows, process builders. So if you are seeing issues related to a transaction taking too long to process, you may need to utilize Apex rather than Flow to complete your task. Also, you have to use Apex if the logic in the flow is so complicated that it makes debugging a pain, or also it makes like documenting and managing the flow, maintaining the flow difficult. In this case, you have to use Apex. And also, if there are like thousands of records to like update, to retrieve, to get, and if you have to work with the big collections of the records, I suggest to move this, at least this part, to Apex, or even the whole flow. Because like I can say from my experience, that when user faced CPU time limits and a lot of other errors and limits, initially we tried to move everything into flows according to one of the strategies that we just discussed. And if we still face these errors, we move some parts of the code, of the automations, into code. But now a lot of customers, they really want to use the flows instead of the triggers, because as I mentioned, somebody non-technical on the customer side still can open the flow and work with it, but they can't work with the code because they're not developers. So if they don't have any developer on their side, they prefer to use flows. And this is when you have to really think that this is too complex process. We have to put it into Apex. And maybe you can create some custom metadata, custom labels that customers still will be able to change some inputs within this process. So that's it. I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope it was helpful for you. Thanks.